So welcome to this next edition of INGSA Horizons interviews. My name is Marc Saner. I'm at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I've been involved in INGSA for some time, and here at our university, I was the founding director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. It's my great pleasure to welcome our interviewee, Elizabeth Seger, at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, University of Cambridge, and also the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, University of Cambridge in the UK. The reason we wanted to interview Elizabeth is because of the release of a major report and follow-up interviews on BBC and other places. The report was issued by the Turing Institute, and the full title is Tackling Threats to Informed Decision-Making in Democratic Societies, Promoting Epistemic Security in a Technologically Advanced World. So the main purpose of the interview is to get some insight into the discoveries and the recommendations in this report. Also to get to know Elizabeth a bit, and then we can take it freely to broader issues. So Elizabeth, I would just like to start with giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit, to also say something about your vantage point, where you're at, what you're looking at, and what's the general direction of your research. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for the very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to go back and forth with you about some of these really interesting issues. As you said, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, and in the Department of Philosophy of Science, and also working at the Centre of the Future of Intelligence. And the angle that I take with my research, I look very much into issues of trust and information. So I'm particularly interested in trust and expertise, and how we acquire knowledge, how we decide to trust the sources that we get our knowledge and information from. And then more recently, I've been looking into how different technologies influence our ability to gather knowledge, communicate knowledge, and then to use that knowledge to make decisions and coordinate action. So that's sort of the vantage point I come from, very philosophical vantage point. I am definitely couched within the epistemology literature, the angle that I take, but looking at how emerging technologies influence our ability to distribute knowledge and use it to make decisions. So that's the vantage point I come from, but I should mention that in writing this report we're talking about today, I worked with an incredible, very large team of people of all sorts of expertise and background, and it was a real pleasure working with them, but also learning a lot from them.
Well, thanks a lot. It's a good starting point. I think a lot of listeners will be immediately convinced that in our time, that trust and information are really important, not just because of the pandemic, but also I think the whole world is watching US politics and other places where the issue of the intersection of knowledge, information, propaganda, all these issues come together in very important decisions for the world. So you in your report, the subheading contains this term epistemic security. Could you explain a bit more what this means, why you chose the term, and what the key features are around that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways, it was kind of an unfortunate choice in title, because that's always the first question I get is, what is epistemic security? So just a brief background. So the root word of the word epistemic is episteme, which is Greek, meaning knowledge. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemic security you can think of as keeping our knowledge secure, or keeping our information secure. So sort of like you can think of national security as keeping the country safe, or home security is keeping your house safe, or personal security is keeping your person safe. Epistemic security, keeping your knowledge safe. And the reason we chose that term is because in starting to write this report, which was a couple of years ago, actually, before the whole pandemic thing happened, we started writing this report, and the approach that we took is we were looking at different crisis scenarios, things like pandemics, but also things like severe economic downturn, climate change, and looking at how information systems and knowledge systems and the way knowledge is communicated throughout different social systems influenced our ability to make decisions and coordinate action to respond to these crises. And what we found in drawing out these maps of different factors that interact and come into play is that there are a lot of points where these systems can just disintegrate and break down, which can lead to a runaway crisis. And so we sort of saw this as a security threat to our existence. Really, it can be thought of as an existential threat. And so we thought epistemic security was a nice way of framing it, sort of to push home the message that it's not just about a bit of misinformation here and there, or, you know, a breakdown of knowledge here and there or something. It's that misinformation, disinformation, knowledge breakdown can lead to these massive crises and allow them to run away in massive, unfortunate ways. So in a way, the term was to provide an interesting angle for thinking about the issue, but also to really emphasize the repercussions down the road that can happen if we don't find a way to make our societies more epistemically secure or robust to different interferences that interfere with our ability to gather knowledge and use that knowledge to make well-informed decisions.
I can see that, you know, the word security is it can be very helpful because it opens it opens up a whole community of security experts who not always connect that well to universities. So I can certainly see a benefit. So I'm curious. So in your report, you mentioned as part of the method, you had a series of workshops. So I'm curious of what, can you tell us who would be sitting in this workshop and what roles do they play? You could even perhaps explain why you invited that particular composition of workshop attendees.
Okay, so full disclosure, I actually ended up coming onto this project as soon as the workshops were over. So I was not personally involved in the compilation of these workshops. I know that a lot of the people that were involved, that were invited by my colleagues before I came on and helped give the theoretical backing and oomph to the project, there were a lot of people that were invited from lots of different areas with relevant backgrounds to issues of epistemic security from a variety of different fields of expertise. So people in national security, government advisors and politics, but also psychology and journalism and information security, cybersecurity. It's really interesting. The field of epistemic security is really interesting because it isn't actually a single defined field. There's no person on the planet that says I am a epistemic security expert. It's a bunch of people from tons of different disciplines that bring their own views and ideas about what it means to use information to reason well, or what different threats to those information reasoning processes are. And everyone will identify different threats depending on what their backgrounds are and have different ideas of how to address them. So we tried to get a very diverse group of people together to help map out these systems and come up with different ideas of different threats that might come around so that we could get as comprehensive as a view as possible. But I know that is what we went for was a comprehensive view, a very diverse background of people from many different areas of expertise.
Well, it makes a lot of sense that for big complex problems you need diversity of ideas, and giving people from different fields not only a chance to contribute but perhaps also object sometimes on priorities. Did you, I mean, looking at the results of these workshops, did you get the sense that clear priorities emerged from such a diverse group of participants?
Yeah, so I think one of the primary outcomes of the workshops was actually just the insight that getting groups of people together like this is one of the most important things that we can do to address epistemic threats or threats to epistemic security. And it's because we realized that, you know, we'd have some people that just kept hashing out similar kinds of issues or really focusing on similar kinds of problems. And it took this diversity of opinions to really get a fuller picture, by no means a full picture, but a fuller picture of what is going on. And so like in our report, a few of our recommendations at the end stem from this idea of building organized communities of experts from all these different areas of expertise that can comment on issues of epistemic security. And that's because these people are out there. There are a lot of people that think about these issues seriously. They're just not all in the same place. They're not necessarily talking to each other. And so it's a matter of identifying who those people are, figuring out who has the bandwidth to help respond to different crises, but also putting them in touch. So the idea of putting together institutions or groups or even a discipline of epistemic security to bring these people together to work on the same issue, but still from their unique vantage points, is sort of the first step that we identified as the first step of the thing to do. In a way, it's sort of like writing a to-do list, and the first thing on your to-do list is get the people in the room who can write a better to-do list. But it is a starting point.
Yeah, that can be an interesting chicken and egg problem. You know, who you invite will affect the result. Well, just one last quick question on this topic. When I first looked at your report, I was actually first thinking of democracy as sort of the thing to protect, the thing, a threat. I wasn't even thinking of pandemics or whatever, but thinking a little bit longer, one thing that is important to protect is the financial system. And I think a lot of CEOs are very worried about hacking into their systems and so on. Did that become, you don't have to go on in detail, but did that become like a dominant issue? Basically the financial component of the whole security question?
It didn't come out necessarily as a dominant issue in of itself. So one of the scenarios that was analyzed in our workshops was a scenario of economic downturn, economic crisis. And so in that workshop, there was definitely a lot of commentary on things like financial security, information security, cybersecurity, and issues like that. But more generally, over the span of all of the different workshop scenarios, it was definitely mentioned, but I wouldn't say that it was really driven home as a primary issue. Again, this might be because of who we had in the room. Maybe we didn't have enough people that were really taking this perspective, in which case that's a problem that should be fixed if this kind of epistemic security network is to be built. But it didn't emerge on its own as an individual problem. Most of what we ended up talking about were a lot of things like psychological shortcomings. We're bad reasoners in general. Even if we have good information, we are not good at parsing through it and figuring out what's important and what's not, especially if there's a lot of draw on our attention. So issues like that tended to come up more often. We talked a lot about adversarial attacks, people who are intentionally trying to put misinformation, or I guess it's intentional disinformation out, and trying to skew opinions, talking about value misalignment. People can have all the same information, and if they have different values and interests, can very rationally come to different conclusions about what to do with that information. So these are a lot more of the kinds of issues that came up. We did have a very heavy showing of philosophers and psychologists, but we tried to make it as diverse as we could as well. So we had a range of opinions, but no, that one didn't show itself as strongly, though I think with a different group it definitely would.
Yeah. Well, it could also be over time that interest shift, crisis shift. And it sounds like once you have a big scope and it's open, there's no issue. You just, start somewhere so that it opens the debate and creates a network. So let's just get to the report a bit more. Would you like to summarize what you would consider the main insights or results or messages of the report?
Yeah. So to say some of the main messages of the report, let's see, we've already talked about quite a bit. Basically, the main messages are we mapped out and tried to sort of distill what some main factors are in sort of disintegrating epistemic security. What comes into play, what factors make it difficult to acquire information and process that information. And these include things like we mentioned, clashing values and value misalignment, also many different psychological factors. We're not good at processing lots of information. But I think one of the key things that we really locked on also is that there is a crisis of trust that's happening right now. There's lots of information out there, and there's more information out there than ever before. And if you think about, if you kind of take more of a linear approach to thinking, well, good decision making requires having good knowledge and information to reason on. So if we have lots of good information, we should be able to come to good conclusions and make good decisions. There's a lot of problems with that linear model. But one key thing that really jumps out is that just because we have tons of information doesn't mean we're good at figuring out which information is the information we should be looking at. And we've already, this has been a problem. This is by no means a new problem. It has been a problem since the printing press. Since people had access to books, you just could not consume the amount of information that was out there. And we are in a situation right now where the volumes of information we have are increasing, but also we have different technologies that mediate the information that we have access to. So there might be technologies that are producing information or technologies that are mediating information, like social media platforms or recommender systems. And the heuristics that we normally use, or the ways that we usually decide what information to trust or what information sources to trust, are not well suited to an environment that is technologically rich in this way. So the kinds of ways that we usually decide when to trust an information source, like another person, is, well, some of it is as simple as listening to the tone of their voice. But there are other things in play, like looking at how many other people agree with the person who's speaking. If there's a lot of people who agree with them, we tend to also be more willing to agree with a person. If what the person is saying already aligns with our interests and values, we'll be more willing to do that. And this is obviously fallible. It's not going to work every time for identifying a trustworthy source, but for the most part, throughout history, it has served us well as a way to identify who to trust and who not to trust. But when you throw new technologies in the mix, that can get really complicated. So, like I said, starting out with a very simple case of listening to someone's tone of voice with natural language processing systems or deep fakes or something like that, it can get very difficult to get a measure of what's behind that voice. So that sort of messes with our innate ingrained ability to process information. Also, like on social media platforms, it can be there through like filter bubbles and stuff. It can look like a lot more people are believing a particular thing or taking seriously a certain bit of information than actually are. This could be because there are fake profiles, or you have chatbots or something that are just bulking it up. But it's also because you get stuck in these bubbles of information that you already agree with just running around you. And so it can look like a lot more people are taking something seriously than actually are. And because we are predisposed to believe things that a lot of people are agreeing with, we go with it. So I think that there's definitely this crisis of trust is a big thing that came out. I think one of the important things about this report to understand is we point to a lot of issues with our information systems, things like clashing values and different psychological factors, and how our trust heuristics are all fallible. These are not new issues. They have been problems for forever. We were specifically looking at how emerging technologies come into play and exacerbate these issues or help them go away. I mean, I think something very key to understand is we are by no means saying technology is bad. It is messing with our information systems. Technology is the problem. Technology is amazing. It has never been, on the one hand, they are making it more difficult to coordinate action because misinformation spreads so much more easily, but also we can organize collective action on a scale never before seen because of information mediating technologies. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. And I think that was one of the key takeaways, is saying this is not bad. This is overwhelmingly good. It's figuring out how to manage it. And then starting to look for solutions. And there are some key solutions we can look to, very specific things like how can we amplify reliable information over unreliable information. But again, I think the thing that we really settled on in the end was the need to build these kinds of communities, and getting diverse groups of people in the room to discuss these issues and feel out what the key issues are.
So it's interesting to me that that there's a lot of optimism. Not because I'm a particular pessimistic person, but I mean, technology is accelerating. So one of the problems you identified is potential mismatch of our instincts, our nature with what's coming our way. And so acceleration makes the challenge bigger, probably. So I'm a bit curious, you know, how the prediction really is. So we had allegedly, you know, you could almost say democracy hacked in the United States. We have old papers alleging that vaccines cause autism are still being used in major ways, in commercial ways, where institutes use that old discredited information to mobilize people against COVID vaccinations. Mm-hmm. So given that, you know, I do see also positive things, but I'm just trying to get a better sense of, in a world of acceleration, how will we win here?
That is a very good question. I don't think I alone have the answer. I think a large part of it, and in a way, this is kind of shooting myself in the foot, or at least the title of our paper in the foot. I don't know how you do that, but is that I think we need to get over this war metaphor, this war on science metaphor, in a way, this security threat metaphor. I think that the epistemic security angle has its benefits, but one of the issues with it is that once we start talking about security or threats to security, or once we start talking about war on science and people just refusing to believe experts, is that we step outside of the realm of normal political discourse. And we start talking about things like executive powers, emergency powers, trade-offs between freedom and security. It has to be one or the other. And I think that we're not there yet, and I don't think we should jump straight to that. We definitely take a step back and think about having more holistic, systemic approaches, sort of this community building thing that I keep harping on about. But yeah, so I think that that's one key thing, is we need to get over this war metaphor, which means, though, it's like, what's the alternative, though? If we're not seeing it as this war, some people just won't believe the truth, and they keep going back to these disproved papers about vaccine side effects, and there's just nothing we can tell them. I think that the alternative side to that is looking at it as a crisis of trust, as opposed to a crisis of a war on science. And this is not actually my own point. A lot of people have said this. I think one of the best articulations of it, though, there's a book that just came out by Maya Goldenberg, and it's called Vaccine Hesitancy. And so it's all couched within the vaccine hesitancy debate. But she makes a very good argument about switching from this war metaphor to a metaphor of a crisis of trust. And when you switch that metaphor, you start talking about things like value misalignment and understanding the interests and the values, the reasons why people are resistant to taking in certain messages. And I think a lot more emphasis needs to be placed on understanding people's perspectives and their interests and values, because I think it's when we refuse to think about these differences in values and perspectives that we get things like mass polarization in different debates. We get people to be even more resistant to the messages that are trying to be pushed. I think that is a key thing we need to focus on. So in a way, forget about the security metaphor. It's important for different reasons. But I think that's key, is to not get so wrapped up on in an us versus them mindset.
Yeah, that is very interesting to me, because I studied biology first, evolution, and there is really there are different ways you can look at our history. One is more symbiotic, collaborative, and one is more competitive, and it really depends on the observer and describer of the history, on which story becomes dominant. So taking this into account, that perspective really does matter for the way the story is told, but also then I think for the methods chosen to, the therapy, to the diagnosis made. I'm curious, if your view is that the network you're building, the past workshops, did you find they helped towards this, this goal of taking collaboration and optimism as useful tools in this, after one identifies these crisis scenarios, which are of course, a very negative and fear-based approach. Do you think this method works? Are you getting there? Are we getting there?
It's hard to say because we haven't really, as a society, tried it out too well. And I don't know if our tiny little workshops that we ran are going to be representative of what it would be like to try and run something like this on scale, and getting everyone in this, just building up institutions to start talking about these issues. So I guess the most straightforward answer is I don't know. But I think getting diverse groups of people interested in talking about the issues and really trying to hash out a game plan is an important place to start. One thing that I do worry about with the suggestion to build these networks of experts on these issues to start talking about how we deal with this crisis of epistemic security is that one of the main drivers of this information crisis we have right now is the global disintegration of trust and expertise. So in what way is putting together a group of experts going to be the answer? And that is a very difficult question to address. And I'm not sure how to start approaching that. I think it probably has something to do with making sure there's widespread public involvement, making sure that there's this feeling of public ownership over some of these projects. I was at a really nice talk a couple of days ago where people were talking about the role of public broadcasting in the United States and how it was this amazing source of public information that was really widely trusted and on average is still quite widely trusted within the country. But it's because when it was originally put forth, it was put forth as a publicly funded, publicly owned, public serving broadcast station. It was quite literally for the people, by the people, and all of that. And so I wonder if there is an aspect to that as well. If the answer to our crises of information and trusted information is in a way going to be this kind of a public-oriented response, a public broadcasting type response, a Wikipedia kind of response. And there's another interesting book on that topic as well that came out recently. I'm just blanking on the name, but I'm happy to send you the title later.
No, it's I think it has been tried before. To bring in big groups. I mean, one example I can think of is after the attack on the Twin Towers. There was an organization came up called America Speaks, and they put a huge numbers of people in a town hall, in a gym with clickers, and they put a decision maker in that hall too, and had to basically at the end of the day say what they're going to do with all their power and all this information. So I think there are lots and lots of models, and I do agree it's useful to be, you know, searching. Problems get solved by work. So
yes, it's not just going to happen.
It's not good to be complacent. So I would like to move to the recommendations in your report. So I see here 7, and I just took my highlighter and highlighted each a word. The first 4 all contain the word methods, develop methods. Then there's 1 on capacity, and the final 2 are on relationships and networks. So that's when I just look at this very globally, you know, 4 recommendations on building methods, 1 capacity, and 2 on relationships or networks. I just wanted to give you that as a starting point to distill for us your recommendations.
Yes. So as far as building methods, the kind of methods that we talk about in the report are things like methods for fact checking, methods for finding ways to amplify reliable information over unreliable information. They're all sort of related to that in various ways. I think the interesting way to think about the different kinds of methods that we can use to counter threats to epistemic security is it helps to think in terms of balancing costs, I find. So information technologies and stuff have made information more widely available than ever. So we can say that the cost of distributing information has gone down. That's good. The cost of acquiring information has gone down. That's good. The problem is that the cost of sifting through that information, evaluating that information, trying to decide which information to look at has gone way, way, way up and is still going up. And so the kinds of interventions we can think about to help fix these threats to epistemic security and help balance out our information environment have to do with lowering the costs to evaluation, but then also raising the costs to information distributors, specifically those who want to or are trying to distribute false information or unreliable information. So if we take something like putting fines or penalties on, say, news sources that don't undertake minimum fact-checking requirements, that would be some sort of an intervention that would raise the costs for distributors who aren't acting responsibly. We can also have things like maybe having certifications for information distributors that do undertake these kinds of fact-checking procedures. And what this does is it lowers the cost of evaluation for information consumers. They can, to an extent, say, oh, that comes from one of these certified epistemically responsible news sources, and that lowers cost for evaluation. Now, there is obviously a huge elephant in the room, which is who gets to decide what good information is and who gets to talk and who doesn't and what they need to do. And that is a massive problem that I don't have all the answers for. But just in terms of thinking about methods, I like the analogy of thinking about balancing costs. Going to building capacity, that sort of has to do with getting networks of people together, but figuring out who has the wherewithal, who has the time, who has the bandwidth to start responding to some of these issues. Can we get them together in a room and actually start working on them? And then we already talked quite extensively about the 2 points on building communities, and that's about actually getting these people in a room and making sure that we are coming at issues of epistemic security from so many angles, precisely because it is not a simple linear challenge. It is a massive systemic challenge, and massive systemic challenges require massive systemic solutions and the need to build infrastructures and procedures. And so those are the last 2 recommendations, but it is a bit of a mishmash there.
Yeah, no, it actually did make sense to me looking at this list, and I actually like it when recommendations are kept to 7, not 24. sometimes your head spins. So I thought it was actually very credible. It's an interesting idea, you know, when you spoke, I had this image that after all the environmental labels of, you know, responsible forestry and dolphin safe tuna, there would be the truth label coming out, possibly out of Cambridge, UK. But it will be a hard sell, you know. It has of course a bit of a pretentious feel to it, you know, and there's so much power contained in distinguishing what is true and what is false that it is practically difficult. But I can see all kind of ways, you know, by which this happens. I mean, the journalists have already been on the case for decades on this problem. I recently heard a talk by the new head of the US National Science Foundation, and he stressed several technologies, but in particular AI and quantum computing. So maybe it's difficult for a university or an NGO to say what is quality information, what is not. But will AI help us? Or is it a threat? Is it yet another epistemic security issue?
I think both is the answer. There are definitely people at the Leverhulme Centre that are working on this issue specifically. In fact, I think there was a report just published about specifically how AI could help us, or how it could help us, how it didn't help us respond to the pandemic crisis, and that was really interesting. But as far as will AI help us with this crisis of information, or as I've seen it written, the infodemic, I think I mean, there are obvious points where you say like, oh, it's definitely a bad thing. And you just look at deep fakes, and natural language processing systems could be an issue. So those are sort of the obvious things people point to. I mean, I guess there could be functions as well that have to do with scanning for information sources, finding indications of things just being produced by bots, or news sources that are replicated, or searching for references. You know, it could be a tool that could be used to just do mass reference searches, search through countless numbers of documents, and finding signs of it being backed up by other sources. That could be a very useful application. Personally, haven't looked into the specific influence of artificial intelligence on these issues, which I definitely should, given that I'm supposed to be writing a chapter on that right now. So yeah, I think that there's definitely, again, a double-edged sword. It's not the technology that's bad or good. It's the people who are deciding to use it, and the guidelines that they have and that they're following. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of panic around artificial intelligence, but it should be panic around the people who are using artificial intelligence, and the systems around it. So yeah. I think double-edged sword is the best answer.
Yeah, something else to watch, something else it increases our complexity, but also could be sometimes a huge solution comes out of nowhere. So I would like, this was extremely interesting. I would like to finish this interview with a question about what's next, and perhaps not only what's next for this particular project you're involved in, but also for you personally. What will you tackle next? What did you, based on what you now learned and seen, what do you want to take on?
Well, let's see, what's next for me personally is finishing my PhD. Would be a very good thing to do. There are several people out there that will agree with that statement. No, but beyond finishing the PhD, I've very much enjoyed working on this report. When I first started it, it was actually quite tangential to my own PhD topic. I was specifically looking at trust and expertise, and how looking at trust and expertise can tell us about deciding when to trust AI systems, and are there overlap between the two. And I started work on this project because it was an interesting side project. It gave me a break to think about something else. It was mildly related. And then it became such an important issue to me. And I'm even finding a way right now to tie it into my dissertation. The the issue of trust around expertise and around technology is most interesting for me. So I would like to continue going down that route and looking at issues of user trust in emerging technologies, but how those issues also compare to lay trust in experts. And I think in both cases, this idea of paying attention to values and interests is really central. And that's less of an unusual idea when we start talking about trust in human experts or trust in science, but seems to be kind of a novel idea when we start talking about trust in AI systems or trust in technology. And I think there are many parallels there that can be drawn out, and I'd like to spend some time really digging those out personally. But as for where this project can go, I think next steps are trying to build some of these communities. And I've had some really interesting conversations with a few people right after the BBC article was published who reached out to me that are trying to build these kinds of communities, that are applying for grants and trying to build these networks. So there are people out there who have had this idea, and I think starting to get everybody in touch and thinking more seriously about how to do this would be the next step for the project. But personally, finishing my PhD and then continuing on these ideas of trust and expertise and seeing how that can help with tech development but also in tech regulation and government, and we'll just sort of see where it goes from there.
Well, that it certainly looks like a topic that gives enough substance for a lifelong career and interest. I'm certain you will do extremely well in your PhD. It's I think it's actually great when during a PhD one has access to new networks, to new practical questions. So I'm glad you had this experience, and maybe theoretically
definitely made it a much richer experience.
So yeah, well, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. I think this was really awesome. You know, we got not only ideas on, not only perspective on important issues, but also approaches that your team took to pursue them, and a sense of interest in the topic and recommendations, practical ideas on how to go about it. So I really think that was a great story to share. For the network, you know, you could look at INGSA too, because INGSA has a lot of value, I think, by being a network. And it's, I think, actually quite a impressive, successful model. So I think that wraps it up. I would like to thank Grant Mills for setting this up, the tech, the idea, and the making this very easy for Elizabeth and myself to participate in. Thank you for that. And I believe that concludes our interview. So I wish you all the very best, Elizabeth. You're very impressive, and I'm sure everything will be great in your PhD.
Well, thank you. It was a joy talking. Thank you very much, both of you.